Hi, this is Steve Piscitelli. Before we get into part 2 of Transformational Leadership, thank you very much for joining us on this last segment of our Transformational Leadership podcast with Dr. John Wall. You will hear me restate the question I posed at the very end of part 1 about being on the bus with all the team members, but the thought, the questions that might arise about where the bus driver is going and what's the best way to approach that situation. And then our conversation will move into how followers can impact leadership. We will look at the importance of feedback, voice, and proximity in building the culture of a transformational leader. How does a transformational leader truly nurture the team's collective genius? And toward the end of this segment, you will hear us talk about the importance of maintaining balance for the leader and the followers and how the transformational leader helps to negotiate sometimes rough waters. And then we will conclude with our typical call to action. Once again, thank you for joining us, and here is part 2. Well, and something I thought of a metaphor that it's kind of cliched metaphor now about, when you're a leader, you get the right people on the bus so that you're going down the road and going in the right direction. And you started addressing that, but what happens when you look at the bus driver and you say, hey, you know what? I'm not sure the bus is going in the right direction. And is there a way to challenge, if that's the right word, to talk to bring it up to the leader above you to say, hey, I have some questions, some doubts, some concerns?
Yeah, I ask questions. That's the strategy that I've decided to employ. I have not really been in a situation where I've had to fall on my sword ever and say, this is just beyond the pale and I can't remain part of an organization because things are, just completely disconnected from what I believe in. But I am somebody who asks questions, and I ask those questions. I may have what my own view is of the answer to that question, but I do try to frame it in a way that says, listen, if I'm missing something here, please educate me, because I want to be in line with the institutional mission. I want to be in line with the people who are leading me. But if there's a disconnection there, help me understand it. Or at the same time, coming back to that sense of confidence in my own judgment, that question may then at least ask a person to think about where are we heading, or let them know that I'm seeing this disconnect, because I think that's important for leaders to be aware of.
And again, I'm hearing vulnerability, I'm hearing I'm hearing confidence. Very important for the leader and for your followers.
Absolutely, and people know if you're engaged with that. I think that the people that you lead want to know, will you be an advocate for them? You know, that you can't just nod to them and say, I care about you, and then turn around and do things that aren't aligned with that. At the same time, you have to pick your spots. You can't, constantly be a burr under the saddle for those who are leading. You got to pick your spots where you're going to do this kind of questioning and try to steer the process. But if you do that effectively, I think that's how you get to that balance.
That's going to lead me in another direction here. We're talking, obviously, about the leader, but there are some other people in this equation, and those are the followers. And it's always easy to say what the leader should do. And, I'm sitting in this chair as the follower, and I can say, my God, that was a boneheaded decision. What are they thinking? What is wrong with them? When you think of the followers, how can they impact leadership? Or can they?
I think that people should absolutely impact leadership. So when you're working in any kind of context like that with a leader, I think that everybody should impact the leadership. I think some of that is certainly through direct communication. And a leader really has to invite that and be willing to do that. Otherwise, the first time you get direct communication is going to be when somebody has had enough, they can't take anymore, and they're going to communicate something directly and walk away. So I think having those channels is absolutely important to have open. But I'd say as well, I think it's important to allow people as a group to have systematic opportunities for feedback. In my field, again, in psychology, we talk about the notion of something that we call voice. And voice is that idea of, do people feel like they have meaningful, participation in what's going on in any kind of process. And when people feel like they lack voice, that's when they become disenfranchised. That's where they feel disconnected. And now that sense of we're all working together towards a goal, now that's just a placard on a wall somewhere. It's not something that's really happening. And so it's important to have that kind of feedback up. And I think it's also important as a leader, and I've learned this a little bit through some experience, even if you feel like the people that you're leading do have an impact, it's important to close the loop and point out to them back where they are having that impact, because you may see it as a leader, but if they don't have an appreciation of that as well, they may not appreciate the fact that they have voice. So it's important to close that loop all the way around.
Yeah, the communication, I'm going back, you talked about authenticity earlier, but there's also a consistency with the authenticity. It's not just saying at the opening staff meeting of the year, of the annual meeting, and just say, I want open communication, and then that's it. It's not the placard, not the slogan.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's that idea of what do you do behaviorally with that. And I'll give you an example. The position that I came into, my predecessor might have had a little bit of a different style than me, and physically where my office is located from the people that I'm working with leading, there's a distance to be there, and
a physical distance.
There are other people on my staff who are located sort of in between the people that I'm leading and where my office is. And so a lot of traffic then kind of gets stopped there and held up. When I came into that position, what my interest really was in terms of establishing real relationships and real communication was to have people come and see me directly. And there was such a dearth of foot traffic. Nobody was coming to see me. And that was just what the culture was. And it took some time and saying, I want to have those conversations. And you can feel when people feel like they might be bothering you, or should I be approaching you? And so really working to kind of break that down. And I'm much happier where that is right now.
Yeah, great. In our time that's left, let's go. I got a couple of points, and then I'd like you to finish up with what you'd like to leave, the main impact with our listeners today. One of the things is this idea of trust. So the leader has to be able to let go at times. And it could be easy for me as the follower to say, trust me. And you're the one that has to report to the person above you. How do you balance that? How do you nurture that collective genius within your team, and stay true to the mission? That seems to be almost a magical act.
That is a real balance when you, especially working in a large organization. For me, and this goes back, I think, Steve, to a lot of the points you talked about early on that characterize transformational leadership. I work with what I call a bias towards yes. When people come to me with an idea, with an issue, etc., my meter internally is set to say, let's assume this is a good idea. Let's assume this is something we want to pursue. Have a bias towards yes in getting there. And that way you are letting people have that impact we talk about. That way you're having that validation that we talked about, that communication that we talked about. The trick with that, though, is to make sure that bias towards yes, when you start to now filter an idea and evaluate it, is it aligned with a broader vision, a broader mission? Because in any organizational context, there should be a vision and a mission that's spelled out, and that then becomes the touchstone. So when people come and say, here's an idea, or here's a piece of feedback that I have, or here's something that I don't like, start with that bias towards yes. Let's assume that everything is valid, and what can I do to address this person's concern? But then we have to both together filter that against our departmental or our organizational vision or mission, and then that helps us stay on the same page in terms of addressing these things.
And as the leader, you've got to be able to communicate that and still keep the followers on the bus so they're not just saying, oh, he doesn't really want to listen. And that's where the authenticity, I would think, over time.
Absolutely. And there are places where, for me, there are places where that looks very different in very different situations. That maybe somebody comes and they have a great idea and we can launch it and it's an instant success and a celebration. And maybe there are places where, as I've been working through a situation, I have inadvertently slighted somebody.
Right.
I had a conversation not too long ago with a faculty member who came and talked to me and really laid out for me this sense of feeling disappointed and frankly unappreciated about some things. And these were small things that they were small enough that none of them individually were on my radar, that this was kind of a misstep. But what the person was communicating to me as they experienced all these things, they came together to give them a sense or a feeling this way. And I needed to listen to that and then acknowledge, you know what? I see exactly what you're saying. Let me reset and let you know that I do value you, and then let me follow that up with actions to get some of these things straight.
It's the validation part.
It is validation, and it's that vulnerability that a person will come and even lay that out for you.
Yeah. Yeah, so true, so true. And I like the way you said that it's not a blunder by any stretch, but it is something that can be overlooked. Oh, that's little. Okay, that's little, but 7 littles is a huge.
They come together, and again, as people experience this as relationships or as their career, right, they experience the things that are happening to them over time.
All right, as we move toward the end, and before we get to your call to action for our listeners today, the theme of the podcast series is growth and resilience. And as a leader, and you've been talking about what the transformational leader does and how that transformational leader connects with the followers, and you have to advance the mission while also communicating a sense of authenticity with your followers. How do you maintain your resilience? How do you maintain your balance? How do you respect your boundaries and your limits, and at the same time, your followers? How do you help them with their boundaries and limits? I'm sure there are days when maybe you go to bed at midnight and you're up at 5. But we both know you do that for too long and there's going to be a problem. And you also know that there are those days when you see one of the people on your team and you know there's something wrong. You know that it could be a sick child, could be a marital problem, it could be financial issues, it could be health issues. How do you help the people who depend on you as a leader, how do you help them with their personal resilience?
Those are all great questions, and I'll start with the idea, so much of what we've talked about today is that idea of things being built on relationships. And there is that distinction between professional relationships and personal relationships. And, my belief is that transformational leadership and its emphasis on relationships necessarily means having a real bond in a professional context, but you need to know something personally about the person. One of the real challenges for a leader then is to figure out, how far does that go in terms of the nature of the relationships of the people you're leading. But let's assume a person has that balance in good place. Those relationships then, organizationally, then that forms a network among people. I've had situations where people that I'm leading have come to me to share concerns about peers who are in situations that you just described. Hey, listen, we need to watch out for this person because they're really starting to show some signs of wear and tear. And
interrupt you for a second. That says something about you as a leader, that somebody would come to you and trust you enough with that kind of information.
And I really appreciate that kind of feedback because it does. It gives you a sense of where you are culturally, and I think a lot of this stuff is cultural, that people will have those conversations. So it's the idea of everybody kind of keeping an eye out for one another. And the truth of the matter is, when you work in a situation like that or with that kind of point of view, people's needs are going to be a little bit different. Your introverts are going to need a little bit of time to unplug and do that. You need to construct that and have that conversation with people and say, listen, if you need a break, or, we need to keep you out of this committee, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of model. Mm-hmm. And we're all keeping an eye on each other in terms of that. And that includes then people who look at me. I've had people when I've gone through particularly, haggard couple of weeks who say, they ask you point blank, are you okay? And that sense of concern does two things. One, it validates me as a leader, keeps me going because people care about me. And two, it lets me know that some of my rough edges are showing, and I better get a little R&R, or I better get refocused, etc.
All right. Excellent. And I'm hearing you. It goes back to the points I'd made. That's relationships. If I don't have a relationship with you, I'm not going to come up to you with either my problem, a colleague's problem, concern, or how are you doing? Very powerful. And again, it's that authenticity, that word you mentioned early on. All right, so John, as we bring it to a close, I'm going to leave this open at this point. Either or both. Would you want to leave our listeners, our leaders, our would-be leaders, even our followers out there, with one thing, if you had to boil it all down, that you'd like them to take away? And I will also give you the final word on that from the standpoint, if there's something that you were not able to address that just dying to get out of your transformational leader thought process, then put it out there for us. So I'm going to give the next 60 seconds to you.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it. It's great to be here talking to you today. Let me flip around and talk about the one thing maybe that's on my mind that I didn't get to get out there, and it's something that I've learned in trying to approach my work as a transformational leader, and that is to recognize and accept the reality that at some point you're going to disappoint people. And so there's a kind of pie in the sky view of transformational leadership. It's relationships. It's great. We understand each other. We can be vulnerable. But when you invite that level of collaboration, when you allow that level of openness, people are going to provide you with input in the form of ideas, critiques, desires. And it's not possible as a leader to always, I have that bias towards yes, but it's not always possible to give people the yes that they want. And when you're a transformational leadership, I think it's compounded because sometimes people are surprised when they don't get that yes. If you're living in a context where you're truly supporting that and then they don't get that yes, I found sometimes that they come back and say, why didn't I get a yes? And you still have that responsibility of leadership to accept those areas of responsibility, make the tough calls when you need to, tell the people the why behind the what, and encourage them to let them know their input does matter, but the answer may not always be what they want. So that's something that I did want to share and get out there.
Yeah, and that why behind the what is so important. I think even aspiring leaders have to understand, and you touched on this when you said be wary of just going in for the trappings. Why do you want to be a leader? It's not just I want to be a leader. That's the what. The why.
Exactly.
So important. All right, folks, that's pretty powerful stuff that John has shared with us. So I'm going to leave you with a call to action, if you would, because forever the classroom teacher I am, you always want students to leave a classroom and apply the information. So I'd like you to apply what John had to share with us today. So here's what I'd like you to do. As soon as you can, take a moment, and I'd like you to think about the leaders you've had, and whether you aspire to be a transformational leader or one of the needed and critical followers on a team, I'd like you to do the following. For the leaders in the audience, do two things. First, identify who you are, identify why you are a leader. Identify why you are a leader, again, or why you want to be a leader. Know the why behind the what. Is it strictly money? Is it strictly title? Is it strictly power? Or do you actually have a mission that you would like to help make the world a better place, even in if it's a small space where you are? And then, second, list 3 things you can do for your followers this coming week that either will help them to or continue to empower their own growth, their own resilience, as well as that of the team. And for the followers, like me out in the audience, what can you do to help your leader be successful and thus your team? So, John, thanks again for being with us. We appreciate it. This has been very powerful. I always get a kick out of being able to work with you. And I want to thank you, the listeners. Without you, there's no Growth and Resilience Network. Visit my website for more information about upcoming conversations on the GRN and about my programs and other resources for your personal growth and resilience. And while you're there, sign up for my email and newsletter list. I'm also pleased to announce that our next 2 podcasts will continue to look at how you can grow. One's going to look at creativity. And just like leadership, can we nurture creativity? And one is going to take a look at balancing career and life from the perspective of a working mother. So until we meet again, either virtually, online, somewhere in person around this great nation, this is Steve Piscitelli from my headquarters, my world headquarters here in Atlantic Beach, Florida, reminding all of us to choose well, live well, and be well. Bye-bye, folks.